Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, Christoph and the organizers for inviting me. I'm especially pleased to be here because this is really like far away from my home turf. So we were wondering what I might talk about, and Christoph said, well, why didn't you address the question, what is an organism? And honestly, if I knew, I'd tell you, but I don't. So instead, I'm going to talk about a feature of organisms that has been overlooked in contemporary evolutionary biology, which is kind of making its way back into evolutionary thinking. And I'd like to talk about some of the implications of thinking of organisms as ecologically embedded systems. Okay. So our current modern synthesis theory of evolutionary biology, a thing we've had since the 1930s, doesn't have a concept of organism in it. It's about organisms ostensibly, but the organism plays no particular explanatory role. It isn't a significantly important feature. Instead, what we have in this theory, we have a theory of the dynamics of superorganismal assemblages, populations of suborganismal entities, genes. Okay. So here's Richard Dawkins, one of the proponents of this view, saying evolution is the external and visible manifestation of the survival of alternative replicators, by which he means genes. Genes are replicators. Organisms are aren't best regarded as organisms. They're vehicles in which replicators travel about. Replicator selection is the process by which some replicators survive at the expense of others. So notice the canonical units here of evolution in evolutionary biology are populations and replicators or genes. Okay. And here's Arvin Argren recently defending this kind of view. He says, by this reasoning, organisms are nothing but temporary occurrences, present in one generation, gone in the next. And as a consequence, organisms cannot be the ultimate beneficiaries in evolutionary explanations. Instead, this role is filled by genes. Genes are considered immortal, and they pass intact from structure from generation to generation. So genes, then, are the only kinds of entities that are long-lived enough to be the canonical units of evolutionary explanation. And he goes on, natural selection is conceptualized as a struggle between genes, right? Usually through the effects they have on organisms, incidentally, for replication and transmission to the next generation. Okay, so we have this disorganized conception of evolution. And here's Richard Lewington saying, well, look, on this view, organisms are just mere objects of the processes of evolution, the suborganismal processes and the population level processes. He says, in this view, the organism is the object of evolutionary forces, the passive nexus of independent external and internal forces, one generating problems at random with respect to the organism, the other generating solutions at random with respect to the environment. And I don't need to tell anybody this is not an endorsement of this view. Okay. It wasn't always like that, right? We're told that the modern synthesis is a kind of updated codification of Darwin's view of evolution. But in The Origin of Species in chapter 3, Darwin says, how have all these exquisite adaptations of one part of the organization to another part and the conditions of life and of one organic being to the other been perfected? And the answer to this question is resolutely organismal. All these results follow inevitably from the struggle for life. Struggling for life is something organisms do. So somehow or other, this organism-centered conception of evolution has been transmogrified into this gene-centered conception of evolution. Okay. The way it came about, I think, is my conjecture, is that evolutionary biology became what we might call a foundationalist theory. The notion of a foundationalist theory is something I borrow from the philosophy of mind and epistemology. And it starts in the following way. When you've got this really complex system that's moving around in its environment, you've got environmental features and you've got features of the system. And the first thing you need to do is to sunder them. Separate that which belongs to the organism or the system from that which belongs to the environment. And then we need to look for the activities of the organism within the mechanisms that reside within the organism. And in order to do that, we posit a given, a feature of the organism from which all these phenomena devolve. And we look to the processes that go on within the organism to explain the activities of the organism. But the organism, or the system in this case, is interacting with an environment, and it has to deal with the features of the environment. So how does it do that? Well, what it does is that these internal processes somehow come to stand for the conditions that the system encounters in the environment. And moreover, in encountering this environment and interacting with their environment, there are these narrow processes of interaction. The system communicates with the environment, in this case of organism, through development, and the environment communicates with this organism, in this case, through natural selection. So it's a foundationalist theory. Now, as I said, I borrow this notion of foundationalist theories from philosophy of mind and from epistemology. And there are familiar computational representational theories of mind or theories of perception have this kind of foundationalist structure. So here's Charles Taylor talking about Descartes' epistemology. He says, we grasp the world through something, what is outside, by something inner. And elaborating more, he says, knowledge of things outside the mind or the agent or the organism only come about through mental images or conceptual schemes within the mind or the agent or the organism. The input is combined, computed over, or structured by the mind to construct a view of what lies outside. Okay, so this is the kind of structure of a foundationalist theory. You separate the system from the environment. You look at the internal workings of a system as ways of representing the features of the environment that are encountered. Okay. Charles Taylor goes on, well, the aim of foundationalism is to peel back all the layers of inference and interpretation in the case of mind and get to something that is genuinely prior to them all. A brute given. So in the case of epistemology, it might be a sense datum. In the case of biology, the brute given is genes. Evolution happens because of what genes do. And here's Dawkins again saying replicators exist. That's fundamentalism. Fundamental. This is a form of foundationalism. So let's look at this kind of foundationalist approach to evolution. And start with the question, what has to happen for evolution to happen? Well, in anybody's view of evolution, you need 4 ingredients or component processes. You need transgenerational constancy, inheritance. Offspring have to look like their parents. You need persistence up to reproduction, development. Organisms have to start for these. Unprepossessing beginnings become these reproductive things, and they have to survive until they do. You need a source of variance. So we're told that natural selection winnows the variations. So you need a source of variation. And we need some kind of process that biases form in the direction of adaptation, because evolution is adaptive evolution. Lineages become well suited to their conditions of existence. And so our foundationalist conception of evolution takes a particular view on the nature and the relationship of these has its own proprietary cause. The processes are autonomous from one another, or quasi-autonomous. And each of them is the consequence of the activities of the same canonical unit of biological organization, the gene. And so what we have then in this conception of evolution is a fractionation. I don't know what's happened. Oh, look at that. Something's gone wrong. Never mind. Oh, look at that. It's reappeared. Okay. So we have inheritance, and that's just the transmission of genes. We have development, and that's just the transcription of a code that's written in genes. And we have variation. The source of variation, the ultimate source of variation in biology is random mutation of genes. So these processes are all driven by the activities of genes, and they're independent from one another. Inheritance doesn't affect development. Development does not introduce variation. Variation and inheritance itself doesn't introduce variation. So, and notice that none of these processes, these are all internal processes, and none of them introduces an adaptive bias. So we need another process that does so. And that's the process of natural selection. This is a superorganismal process that pushes collections of genes around this adaptive space. So natural selection is the differential retention of genes in a population. And here's a very ardent defense of this view from the Charlesworths. They say allele frequency changed caused by natural selection is the only credible process underlying evolution of adaptive organismal traits. Okay, so we have this foundational theory that separates organisms from their environment, looks to the activities of this canonical unit of biological structure, the genes, and then these external processes, selection to introduce bias. And these are quasi-autonomous problems. So it's probably no news to anybody here that since the turn of this century, this foundationalist theory of evolution is in turmoil. So we have the extended evolutionary synthesis and various attempts to update the theory, and they all begin from an observation. And the observation is that this particular theory underdetermines the results of the component processes of evolution. Now, I want to suggest that this is no accident. This problem of underdetermination is a systemic problem of any kind of foundationalist theory where a certain kind of system is involved, viz. An agential system. But let's look at this underdetermination problem. So it turns out that replication is just simply not enough to capture the dynamics of the intergenerational constancy of form, the kind of constancy of form that makes a difference. So in the last 25 years, an enormous number of processes have been discovered that contribute to the intergenerational stability of form, including parental effects, epigenetic effects, ecological inheritance, cultural inheritance. This diagram is taken from a really beautiful paper by Etienne Dolchin and Philippe Neumann in 2019. And it goes nicely with this claim by Kevin Lala and colleagues that heredity is more than a package of genes and cellular resources handed over at conception, like the baton in a relay race. It is a continuous process of developmental reconstruction that spans the life cycle. Okay. So it turns out also that in order to account for the dynamics of development, we need more than just the transcriptions of genes. So here's another quotation from Sonia Sultan. She says, developmental outcomes are shaped by multiple types of information and not by DNA sequence alone. Phenotypes emerge from the real-time regulatory interactions of the evolved genotype with the transient environment and environmentally induced or stochastic epigenetic influences that occur at timescales within a generation to several or many generations. So the conceptual resources of genes encoding traits is simply not enough to account for development. Nor is mutation sufficient to account for the emergence of novelties in evolution. So here's Sonia and colleagues saying, much novelty in evolution thus appears to be possible without the need to evolve novel genes, pathways, or cell types. Exactly why, how, and when evolutionary innovations occur and unfold the way they do has thus mostly eluded conventional molecular, population, and quantitative genetic approaches towards understanding evolutionary processes. And here again, there's more to adaptive bias in evolution than simply the differential retention of genes in a population. So here's Herman and colleagues saying, individuals in a number of plant and animal taxa have the ability to adaptively alter their own and their offspring's development in response to environmental stresses, such that the offspring show increased tolerance to the stresses in question. And again, Armin Mocek says, when confronted with the novel or stressful environments, the self-constructing and self-adjusting nature of development has significant potential to bias the production of phenotypic variation towards functional, well-integrated, and potentially novel variants, even in the absence of mutational variation. I'm going heavy on the quotations because these are actual practicing biologists who are grappling with this issue of underdetermination. Okay. So there's another element to this underdetermination too. I don't know if I'll have time to develop this in any great detail, but the theory of natural selection, the differential retention of genes in a population, is incapable of capturing the adaptive dynamics of population change. So we tend to think of evolution as taking place on this adaptive landscape where the peaks represent good spaces in adaptation and the valleys are less so. This is something developed from Sewell Wright. And the account of population change that we get derives from Fisher and Haldane and Wright early in the 20th century. And Fisher gives us this geometrical model of how it is that a population undergoing differential retention of genes can climb these adaptive peaks. And he says, well, the geometrical model basically just says, look, small mutations are required because small mutations are less likely to be deleterious. But there's a really long-standing problem with this account of natural selection by population change by natural selection as a cause of adaptation, because the account that we're given of the dynamics of genes doesn't tell us anything about why the adaptive landscape should be shaped in the way it is, why adaptations should be multiply peaked, all this how it is that a population moves from one peak to another. There are suggestions from Sewell Wright. But basically all this theory does is it tells us how a population behaves in the vicinity of an adaptive peak. It doesn't tell us anything about the topography of the adaptive landscape. Okay. There's another problem with the account of adaptation, and it's this. It underdetermines the explanandum, right? It underdetermines, so what it is to be an adaptation is thought to be an organism fitted to this location and adaptive space determined by the environment. But the environment radically underdetermines what counts as an adaptation. Take the case of locomotion in water. So these organisms have all solved it, but they've all solved it in different ways. Ostensibly, the environment is the same. What makes the difference between these adaptations is the capacities of the organisms, the goals of the organisms, their structures. And so one has to take into account how the organism experiences the environment, how the organism encounters the environment to get any explanation of the phenomenon of adaptation. Okay. So we have this kind of systemic underdetermination problem. And it hasn't gone unnoticed. Here's Richard Lewington again, saying the time has come when further progress in our understanding of nature requires that we reconsider the relationship between the outside and the inside. This is this issue of separation that I was talking about, between organism and environment. Now notice he says the time has come to reconsider this. That time was the turn of the century. So a quarter of a century away from this, we're still kind of grappling with this claim that this thing that Lewington is enjoining us to do, right? So Lewington gives us some clues about how we might go about this. The clues involve rethinking the relationship between the organism and the environment. He says there is no organism without an environment, but there is no environment without an organism. There's a physical world outside of the organism, and that world undergoes certain transformations that are autonomous. But the physical world is not an environment, only the circumstances from which environments can be made. This is basically an underdetermination claim. So how do you make an environment from a physical world? Well, the environment, he goes on to say, the environments of organisms are made by organisms themselves as a consequence of their own life activities. So this is a venerable old view, and I think we can see resonances in Schelling from Ulrich's talk. This is a view that had a certain amount of currency in the early 20th century that seems to have been lost. We'll hear more about this from later in the week, I'm sure. But here's John Scott Haldane saying, the organism is thus no more determined by the surroundings than it at the same time determines them. There's a kind of reciprocity between organism and environment. The two stand to one another not in the relation of cause to effect, but that of reciprocity. Okay. And here's Kurt Goldstein saying, one could say that the environment emerges from the world through the being or actualization of the organism. Okay, here's this kind of radical rethinking of the organism-environment relation that Lewontin is calling for. Now, this rethinking of the organism-environment relation is a little bit difficult to get to, especially for somebody who's been trained in modern synthesis evolutionary thinking, but we might look again to sort of recent analytic epistemology and philosophy of mind, or especially philosophy of mind that's inspired by phenomenology, to kind of make more concrete this organism-environment reciprocity. So here's John Haugeland saying, the contrary of the separation is something I would like to call the intimacy of the mind. He's talking about the mind here and knowledge, but we're supposed to carry these lessons over to the organism-environment relation. So the mind's embodiment and embeddedness in the world. The term intimacy is meant to suggest more than just necessary interrelation or interdependence, but a kind of commingling or integralness of mind, body, and world that is to undermine their very, very distinctness. So the concept of the environment that Lewontin is calling for is this kind of intermingled, integral notion where the environment and the organism's capacities both contribute to, or the physical world and the organism's capacities both contribute to the realized environment, but one can't separate the contribution of the physical world from the contribution of the organism to the making of this realized environment. So here's Gareth Matthews telling us about Merleau-Ponty's conception of the way that the agent is embedded in her world. The world for us is more than simply the spatial container of our existence. It is the sphere of our lives as active, purposive beings. The world is the place we inhabit rather than simply a set of objects that we represent to ourselves in a purely detached way. And here again, here's Hubert Dreyfus saying, humans operate in a world organized in terms of their needs, interests, and bodily capacities without their minds needing to impose a meaning on the meaningless given. So my suggestion is we can take lessons from this kind of phenomenology-inspired conception of mind, of epistemology, of perception, and think of organisms as embedded in this environment that they construct themselves in response to the features of the environment. Oh, and so here's the star of the show, Maurice Merleau-Ponty saying, perception is not an inner representation of an objective world, but, Gareth Matthews on Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but a relation of inhabiting the world. The world for us is more than simply the spatial container of our existence. It is the sphere of our lives as active, purposive beings. The world is the place that we inhabit rather than simply a set of odds. Oh, I see, we saw that one already. Great, okay. So my suggestion is, sorry about that, is we can take this conception of the thinking being as agent, embedded in this world of its own creation, partially of its own creation, and transpose this into the organism and environment relation. Why can we do that? Why? Because organisms, like humans, are agents, right? So here's Ludwig von Bertalanffy. Sorry about this slide, it's a mess. Saying you cannot even think of an organism without taking into account what variously and rather loosely is called adaptiveness, purposiveness, goal-seeking, and the like. This one's better. Here's Sonia Sultan again saying, look, we have to think of organisms as agents. And agency is the capacity of living systems to participate in their own development, maintenance, and function by regulating their own structures and activities in response to the conditions they encounter. Okay, so how should we think of the organism as agent? We shouldn't think of the organism as an intellectual being necessarily, but we can think of agency as this kind of dynamical phenomenon, a phenomenon of the way a system moves through its setting. So agency on this view is a gross dynamical property of a system. Agents have repertoires, and they have goals, and they have affordances. So agents enlist their repertoires of activities in ways that reliably realize their goals, given their affordances. And this triad of concepts, goal, affordance, and repertoire are interdefinable, I think. This concept of affordance probably doesn't need any introduction here, but it was introduced by Gibson in his ecological theory of perception. And Gibson says the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes for good or ill. I mean by it something that refers to both the environment and the animal. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment. And Stoffagen updates this saying, affordance are opportunities for action. They are properties of the animal environment system that determine what can be done. Notice they're not properties of the organism. They're not properties of the setting. They're properties of the interaction of the organism and setting. Okay. So this gives us a different conception of the role that the organism plays in the natural world. So the organism is embedded in its ecological setting, creating this ecological setting as it goes, responding to this ecological setting. And for it, the world is a world imbued with meaning, significance, right? So this introduces a kind of new mode of being. I'll call it the constitutively perspectival. So to be an agent is to take a perspective on the world, in as much as the agent encounters the world as featuring opportunities for action. Opportunities for action are only things that exist in the interface between agents and their environments. Threats to their existence. They offer goals and they offer imperatives. Organisms have to do certain things to stay alive. And here again is another biologist, Tobias Uller, saying organisms are agents because of what they do, and they must continue to be agents to stay alive, okay? So we have this kind of set of properties that are neither properties of the organism nor properties of their external setting, but they're properties of the interface between organisms and their systems. And they're imbued with meaning, they're normative. And it's this space, we might call it an affordance space, that organisms interact with and exist in. So because organisms take a perspective on the world, and certain properties of the world are constituted by perspective, then agency is augmenting. There are constitutively perspectival facts and relations in the world with agents that do not exist in the world without agents. There are more norms and needs and goals. And these properties are difference-making. You can see the difference they make to natural phenomena. So they make these constitutively perspectival facts make observable, predictable regularities in the world that exist in virtue of agential activity. And the crucial thing is that these constitutively perspectival features of the world are opaque, which is to say, you cannot see them from the perspective of a foundational theory, right? Because they exist in a place that the foundational theory doesn't recognize, the interface between the organism and its setting. Okay. So how should we think of what the organism does as somehow or other bringing forth these features, these constitutively perspectival features, and those features in turn making a difference to the way the world is? So here again, we can borrow some insights from Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty says that the things in our visual field solicit our attention, or they summon us. So he says to see an object is either to have it on the fringe of one's visual field and not paying attention, and to be able to concentrate it, or else to respond to this summons by actually concentrating on it, taking it in, taking in its meaning. And for the normal person, the subject's intentions are immediately reflected in the perceptual field. They polarize it, they put their stamp on it, or finally effortlessly give birth to a wave of signification. And this, I think, is what's going on when organisms respond to the features of their environment. They respond to them as they are required to in order to stay alive, as they are required to in order to pursue the advancement of their goals. Now, sometimes what we've seen with this idea of methylation and developmental regularity and phenotypic plasticity, phenotypic accommodation, the structuring of one's environment through niche construction, these processes also serve to routinize these responses of organisms to their conditions. And there's an analogous process that Merleau-Ponty calls sedimentation. He talks about a sedimentation of our mental operations, which allows us to count on acquired concepts and judgments, just as we count on things that are there and given as a whole without our having to repeat them or synthesize them at each moment. So the idea is that these responses of various biological features make the responses of organisms stable, and they can make them intergenerationally stable. And if they're intergenerationally stable, they can be subjects of evolution. Okay. So what are some of the processes that organisms use to respond to the summonses of their environment? Well, we've seen some of these things. These are the processes that make up the extended evolutionary synthesis. They are epigenetic marking, gene function regulation, developmental novelties, immune responses, ecological engineering. And these sedimentation responses also include things like epigenetic inheritance, immune inheritance, microbiota transmission, ecological engineering, processes that make it the case that the features that an organism has developed make it more likely that their offspring will develop these same features. Okay. So we should think then of adaptive evolution as taking place on not an adaptive landscape as such, but an affordance landscape as such. Organisms move to, and lineages of organisms move to those places in which they are best able to exploit the affordances of their environment. So in adaptation, so there's this kind of reciprocity that we saw Haldane talking about. In adaptive evolution, organisms respond to conditions they create. And in response to creating these new conditions, affordances, they make changes. But these new conditions, and they change those conditions, but these new conditions elicit responses. And in responding to these affordances, lineages of organisms get to places where they are optimally exploiting the features that they encounter. So the peaks on the adaptive landscape are places in affordance space, not environmental spaces. And the topology of the landscape is determined by organisms' capacity to construct and respond to these affordances. This is very, very ill worked out, but I think that an account of adaptive evolution as reciprocity, response, and creation to affordances will give us a better understanding of the topology of adaptive space. Okay. Oh, so how should we think of evolution then from this perspective of the organism as an agent? Well, we should take it that the component processes of evolution all arise from organisms' struggle to survive. I'll just call that development. From their inception to their death to their reproduction, they're struggling to survive. And the struggling to survive then is the process of creating or constituting these affordances, they're responding to the affordances and changing in response to those. And these processes give us intergenerational stability of form and inheritance. They also give us adaptive novelties, and they also give us adaptive biases. Now, on this view, then, the processes, the component processes of evolution are not independent of one another. They're not quasi-autonomous. The processes that produce novelties also introduce adaptive biases. The processes that produce adaptive biases are also bias inheritance, right? So all the processes that the evolutionary extended evolutionary synthesis can be put into the schema. They're all processes by which organisms respond to the summonses of their environment, alter their conditions, alter themselves, and pass those altered conditions on. Okay. So that's a kind of alternative conception of how evolution might work. It's a consequence of the agential activities of organisms, the construction of their conditions of existence, their response to the conditions of existence, and their sedimentation of those conditions of existence. Now, this looks like quite an alien conception of evolution. It's certainly very, very different from the modern synthesis conception of evolution that I grew up with, but it has certain resonances with a certain historical antecedent. Remember that Darwin says, how have all these exquisite adaptations of one part of the organization to another part, and the conditions of life, and one organic being to another being perfected? Well, he says all these results follow inevitably from the struggle for life. So one can interpret this kind of notion of the organism as an embedded ecological agent that is the source of all evolutionary changes as a kind of interpretation of Darwin's conception of evolution following from the struggle for life. Okay, thanks very much.